Thank you, Diane. So you read for today an article that Diane and I wrote some time ago. It was on community land trusts.
When Jose Carlos was a master's student.
Yeah. And so in that article is about community land trust, collective property. And what I have been doing lately in my dissertation is to see whether that's actually something that is only coming from the global north, or there are some experiences of that in the past of Peru, of Latin America and Peru. And that's what I'm doing for the dissertation. I thought about presenting that for today, but the presentation of Salvador of the other day made me think that it would be more interesting for you to present some of my previous experience working as an urban planner in Peru. I don't consider myself an urban planner anymore, so it will be a presentation of a retired urban planner what I'm going to show to you. But I think it's going to be useful for yeah, I went out. So let me tell you about this experience. It's the Peruvian Urban Reform of 2021. So let's see. So by the Peruvian Urban Reform of 2021, I refer to the approval in that year, 2021, of the Sustainable Urban Development Act, which was the first time in Peruvian legislative history that there is a national level law on urban planning, and of the National Policy of Housing and Urbanism approved by the President and his cabinet, which is these two instruments that were approved in this year. This in general, and it has many critiques as well, but it was a big shake of urban planning practice in Peru, and I will say in Latin America. Now, and a little of the story of my intervention on that, and also of its shortcomings that you will see it in its experience, and also some critiques that I have of urban planning as well. It's what I'm going to try to articulate, and I think this is going to be more useful to you, and I think it helps me also to make sense of what was that experience also for me and for the people that participated. So let me take you through this, and it will be in three parts: the experience, the reform itself, and the lessons that I'm extracting from it. So let's go first with the experience and what Diane was saying. So after working as a real estate lawyer for a while in Peru, I came to the map program. That's a picture of the studio review of the first year with my class, and that's one of these community participation events that you do in the second year. Now, after returning, and I graduated in 2019, after returning to Lima, I continued working in the academia. I was a professor in the School of Law at the Catholic University, and also in activism. And the activism mainly was in this research group, CORNUR, the name of the research group that I am still linked to in Catholic University in Lima. It's almost like a think tank, but also with an interesting activism and pushing some policies from the university. So it's a bunch of faculty from social sciences, architecture, and law that have this interesting housing, governance, and urban planning. So those are the three topics that we work. And I think it is going to be important there because it's part of that group who pushed this reform, as I'm going to tell you in a moment. So that's what I went back to do when I finished the Master in Urban Planning in 2019. What else? But in Peru, well, the normality is to have political crisis. I think the US is starting to get some of those, but in Peru it's actually the normality. And to give you an idea of this, between 2016 and 2022, there were 6 presidents in succession in Peru. Just to tell you a little bit, the first president in the left, Kuczynski, was impeached or was about to be impeached, and then he resigned. Then the vice president entered. He did a fairly good job, I will say, but then he was impeached by a Congress that was majority conservative. So, and that put that third president in the seat, and that just summarizing many things, created a huge uprising by the people, and these are some depictions of that uprising. That third president only lasted 1 week. Interestingly, the push of the people ousted this president, and what happened was that the fourth president entered, and this was a consensus president. So it was not a president elected by the people, I don't know what that tells you about how people elect presidents, but it was like a president that was the consensus of the parliament choosing one of their members. And he entered, and he was only going to have 1 year to finish that period of presidency until the new election will come. Then the new election came, there was a new president, and he was eventually also impeached, and there's a new president now, so that thing is going over and over. And maybe the next person will be impeached, who knows, yeah. But there was that moment of a transition where there was a president that was a consensus government, and when I say consensus, it's a person that wasn't a person that was that much in politics for his whole life. He had some more connections to academia, to the technocratic area of the state. So that's a moment in which many people that were not necessarily in politics or in the government entered the government. And in those I include myself. And many of us actually also entered. In my case, I hadn't worked for the national government, never. I had only worked for a while for the municipality of Lima, but that was it. But many of us entered also because of the sense of duty that we felt in that critical moment. Because of this, it was a moment in which we had been protesting in the streets, and it was the opportunity that, okay, you're now with the possibility to be in the government, so okay, do you want to do anything? And there was a chance, and that's what I. That's what I started doing. I was living in Cusco, my hometown at that moment. It was also late 2020, the pandemic, and I was called to Lima to an interview with the administration of this president, and they asked me. So the positions that there are advisor to the minister, which will be a more like on the background possibility, or director of urbanism, which was to be manager of one of the branches of this Ministry of Housing. And I, thinking that I was also already applying for my PhD, I was thinking advisor to the minister will be actually a nicer position. And that's what I told them. But they didn't listen to me, and they appointed me director of urbanism. And this is a bit of the experience on that. So let me... And again, in parentheses, this was pandemic time. So, for example, this picture in the left is my house. That was my office for some moments in that administration, because there will be, and this is the Ministry of Housing, there will be an outbreak of COVID for some days, so we will have to be moved to our own houses. They will bring our computers. So, for example, in that picture, I'm signing the original version of one norm, of one regulation, that many things are digital, but the real originals that go to work have to be signed, and they will bring it to my home for me to sign them while I was in meetings. So it was a very hectic time, as you can imagine, as all of us experienced. But, well, just to give you more context, the Ministry of Housing in Peru is the equivalent of the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the US, the HUD. And there, what you're supposed to do is mainly the regulations and the legal and political framework of urban planning for the whole country. You don't do the urban plans, because that's a responsibility of every local government, as it is in any normal country. So you there are making these general regulations, the framework, the software under which the municipalities are doing the urban planning. And just to give you an idea, sometimes Diane overstates this, but I had many people on top of me. So, for example, here we have the leaders of that branch. I was the director of urbanism. There was a director of housing, a director of territories. Over us, there was a general director of policies in general, and over us there was the deputy minister. The deputy minister was some sort of the CEO of this branch of the administration. And on top of that, there was the minister, which will be the equivalent to the secretary, which is a more political person that is going to the meetings, going to the cities. So the running of the business of the ministry, it was these people. So it was Elizabeth Añaños, the person that wrote. She was the deputy minister of housing and urbanism. So and I was in charge of the regulations of urban planning and urban policy. And many of those were Zoom meetings, Google meetings, because that's the time where we were. And what it entailed, to give you an idea of what I had to do, I entered to manage that branch of the framework of the regulations. So that entailed, and that's why I was scared initially to this, not necessarily doing intellectual work, but actually managing a group of people. It was hiring people, also firing many people. I had working for me between 100 and 150 people, because we were not only doing norms, but we were also giving technical assistance to many municipalities in the urban plans that they were doing, that they were developing in many places of the country. So we had lots of people and lots of companies hired to do that, which is something problematic. I'm going to speak about that in a moment. So there were tons of people that you will have to also control, supervise, and then you have to have a structure for all of this. In this position of director of urbanism, there had only been directors that were architects, which is who usually do the urban planning in Latin America. It was the first time that it was a lawyer. That was sometimes a little tricky for some architects to deal with, but in a way, I think I'm also going to speak about that. It could be also something that worked well in this case. And as always, and as any position that is of this type is, this meant that to me came mainly the difficult decisions in urban planners. So there were many teams that were doing many things, and only when there will be a very difficult thing, they will come to me, because there will not be the time to review all the cases. For example, they will be dealing with a company that is doing the urban plan in this city of the country. When they are about to terminate the contract with the company and then fire the shot and make an arbitration and make a litigation, then the last call will be on me and maybe the general director, and that's the nature of these positions. So it was a very manager type of position, and maybe on the side of that was the ideas or the policy that anyone has. But still, I think it is important, because that's how probably you sometimes have the handle or something, and then you can push forward something that maybe you can be helped with other people bringing the ideas. So I told you about how it worked. Let me tell you what was the reform about. So you know what was a bit of the context, and also what we were pushing in this reform. Maybe the main idea is that this was a methodological change. It was not doing projects. We only had 1 year, so our idea was to leave a framework that was totally new, that could be implemented and put into practice in the new administration that was going to be entering the next year. So it was a change in the legal framework of planning, again, not urban plans or not physical interventions. So the previous situation was a bit of this. Informality was or is the main issue usually in large Latin American cities, and maybe even more than an issue, it's the story and also the positives and the negatives of the urban history of Latin American cities has informality and the communities organized as their center. However, in the most extreme situations, sometimes they work very well and they are thriving, but in the most extreme situations, they are also building in some places that are prone to risks. This is just a case of the landslides that we had in Peru in the 2017 summer that sparked many changes, because people had been building in the places where the rivers were going to eventually come. But even more than that, that informal development, that expansion, and that informal sprawl, we could say, was also a mode of development that entailed much more costs for any city to handle. Now, the response to that before our reform was a very technocratic and modernist type of planning, similar to what Salvador explained the other day. So it was a large-scale type of planning, a very technical type of planning. Urban planners think they have like a science in their practice, so they tend to be very technical. Centralized as well. There was a lot of dependency of the municipalities to the national government to do their plans. Mechanized and quote unquote sophisticated. For example, you will have to have GIS in your plans to approve them. That makes sense in Lima. That doesn't make sense in a 2,000 people city. Standardized as well, because of that idea of trying to have the plans in one specific place where everybody can consult them, and also very problematic, outsourced. Urban planning should be one of the most core functions of the public administration, and yet it was outsourced to companies. That sometimes they did it good, sometimes they did it bad, sometimes they did it corruptly as well. It was a form of neoliberalization also of planning, and it was done in a huge scale. And for example, here I put a picture of the handbooks or the manuals that the ministry will give to these companies or to these urban planners to put together the plans for the whole country. So basically, if you are an urban planner, the mechanic of being an urban planner was to be in whatever city you were in the country and take one of these manuals, one of these handbooks, and go item by item, fulfilling each of them, even sometimes without visiting the place, and putting together a plan that is eventually going to be judged according to the manual. That large-scale type of planning, and also very, again, technified and standardized, was very problematic. And this is an Instagram picture of one of my stories when I was in my first weeks in the ministry. The plan, one of the deliverables of the plan of Piura, a city in the north, had arrived, and it had been submitted by the company. And it was just this. It was just, they brought it in a truck, and it was tons and tons of cases of these files that had this, what we called an encyclopedic type of planning that was, I think, in general, not useful to what we needed. But that's a bit of the surprise that I got from these kind of things. And these stories of my Instagram ended up being a good archive to remember these things and also to put together this presentation. So that was a bit of what was the previous situation before the reform. Now, let me take you to the reform itself. And here I am using actually some of the slides that we ourselves used in the socialization process of this. So let's see. The policy centers in informality in its diagnosis. And this is also something that I'm reflecting a lot nowadays, but at least in this space, we took informality as a negative concept. And the idea and also the studies that the diagnosis of the policy were based on said that from the last 20 years before the reform, so from 2000 to 2020, the cities in Peru, the main cities, the 40 largest cities, had expanded 39% in their size. But from that expansion, 93% was informal. 93% was some form of informal development. That's why in some of the conversations that I've had with you, it is not a joke to say that urban planning just doesn't serve any function, basically, in some of these cities. 93%, only 7% was some kind of formal development. And yet they have some logic. That's not to say that they don't have some logics. And the policy for this, and one more thing there, it's not that the government doesn't know about this and it is not able to control this, but it's sometimes that the government, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, is promoting this, because what does the government do is once there are these informal settlements, they give titles. And just giving titles is just the main incentive to do more of these invasions or of these occupations. The policy of the government was for the poor, giving titles. They will build their houses, but we will just give them titles. That was the land policy or the urban policy. And the housing policy, that was another different policy, was to do subsidies for housing, but especially for the middle class. And that was, in a nutshell, the policy that the government had for this situation. So what is already invaded, I cannot do anything. I just give titles. I do some housing policy, but I just support mortgages for the middle class. So interestingly, the government puts money to these things, but puts it in this way. I think aims to the incorrect place. So the idea of the whole policy change was something very simple: to increase the supply of social housing, to increase the supply of housing for the poor, in a way of competing for this that is very attractive to any family, which is buying informal lots, informal houses, or informal lots mainly, because they won't be able to afford the social housing projects that are sponsored by government. So it's just tackling the supply of social housing. That's the main idea. So it's aiming to the poor, just forgetting about supporting the middle class sector. But what was interesting in this is that was able to gather the opinions of many different stakeholders. Progressives were interested in this because it was looking at the poor, it was looking at the informal settlements, but also more conservative sectors, especially the construction sector, the companies that were in the construction sector, were also happy with this because it meant more construction and more densification of cities. So it was easier to just focus in one enemy, which was speculators. And the speculators at the granular level and also at the large-scale level. So large real estate companies that hold a lot of land and they are speculating in the city, but also people that are just buying a plot of land in an informal neighborhood just to have a spare lot, even if they already have a lot. So speculators at the local or at the small level or at the large level, that was our enemy in the policy. So we try to put together a coalition with the private sector as well, and also with the academia, with the municipalities, and the progressive sector. The policy is, as any policy, a very complex document, very complex and dry document. This is not to read it, just to give you a glance of what it looks like. It also shows you how these policies are supposed to be constructed, which is in a very rational and I think problematic way. You have to go with a statement and then going from direct causes to indirect causes to alternatives to solutions, objectives, guidelines, and services, which are only the actual programs that the government will do. So there is this idea of making a very well thought thing. I think there is no sufficient space for common sense for starters, but also observation, qualitative approaches. That's a very big issue. This was a 450 pages document, so it was just gigantic. But well, I'll give you a summary of what was these four main objectives of the policy to give you an idea. That was also difficult to socialize just because of the complexity of the document. But the structures of the public administration made you do a document like that. So 4 parts, or four changes that the policy was proposing. One is effectiveness of urban planning. So instead of looking for doing better urban plans or doing more urban plans, the idea was to do more effective urban plans. And in this one of the 4, I'm going to dwell a little bit more because I think that's more connected with what we do in the class. So first, the idea was to have a more decentralized type of planning. So forget about the Ministry of Housing doing the plans for the municipalities. The municipalities should do their plans. If they do it well, nice. If they don't do it well, okay. If you fail, at least you are more accountable to your constituency. So the Ministry of Housing only gives technical assistance. That was a main change in this. So it was decentralizing this to the municipalities. The national government does do guidelines instead of manuals. So we are not telling you how to do the plans. We are perhaps sharing with you how other municipalities have done something. And there was this change from manuales to guías as a political move in relation to that, and basically do away with the standardization. That was something that even in my team, we were not all in agreement. People are very adamant of using like the technical tools that urban planners use. I was thinking that a small municipality should be able to just take a paper in the wall and draw there something, and if they politically agree on something in a small municipality, that should be the urban plan, and that's it. You don't need to have any sophisticated math. That's something that even architects in my team were not in agreement with. But this idea of, in general, of doing away with standardization was something that is in the core of the policy. And something also, and one last thing connected to this effectiveness of urban planning is also to make the connection between urban plans and money, budgets, because budgets are usually managed by a different ministry than the Ministry of Housing. It's the Ministry of Economics and Finance in Peru. And that was also a huge fight to change the framework of how budgets are allocated in Peru. This is even something that the Ministry of Finance has fought later after this to reduce it a little bit. But the idea is that if you do an urban plan, basically the things that you politically have agreed as the prioritized projects of your geography, those have some extra points in the budgeting allocation system that is run by the Ministry of Economics. And that's something that, of course, will make majors be wanting to do those plans, and that's a bit of what was tried to do. That's totally still in the paper, because it's difficult to convince them the supra-ministry that there is in Peru, which is the Ministry of Finance, because of course they have the money. But that was part of the effectiveness of urban planning that we tried to change. That's the first one, on urban planning, or the effectiveness of planificación urbana y territorial, as it was called. A second one was land, and specifically the idea of land titling no more. And this is what I was telling to you. The general policy in Peru had been people invade, people occupy, and I'm going to give titles. The idea was just to cut that from the get-go. That's difficult because there are still extensions of that by the political part of the government, but the main intent that we had is to change the big agency of land titling, which is called COFOPRI in Peru. It's one that is famous because it worked with the ideas of Fernando de Soto, a famous urban economist, that and with the help of the World Bank during the 90s, they were the big laboratory of land titling in the world, and they were proud of having given many land titles, and those policies were even later replicated elsewhere in Latin America and even in Africa and other places. That specific agency was turned into a cadastre agency with the help of a loan by the World Bank again. So it was interesting that it was the same agency and the same international agency now putting money, effort in doing cadastre, which is a more useful tool for managing cities than land titling. That COFOPRI entity is still today like with these two heads. It does still give titles. We were trying to have them at least give titles to maybe a small hospital or a small police station, but they still give titles. But at least they have this other branch of doing cadastre or giving advice to municipalities to do cadastre, and that's something that is still going on. But that was part of that big shift of not giving land titles. So that was again turning the ideas of not only COFOPRI but also the World Bank in this. So that was land and land titles. Third, it was housing itself. Housing, as I was telling you, social housing was mainly going to middle classes because of these supporting subsidies that the government gives. And that's discouraging because it's not that the government doesn't use money for the housing sector. The government does use a lot of money in the housing sector. And that also happens, I will say, in the US. The government spends a lot of not only money but also effort in the middle classes, thinking that it is helping also the construction sector, it is creating jobs, when actually your job as a person that is doing housing policy should not be that. Should be actually going to the people that are needing a house because you don't have a roof to live, or you don't have a house where in the context of the pandemic. So the big shift there was to move the social housing policy only to the poor. So that entailed a couple of things. For example, just a change in the terms. In Peru, there existed only the term social housing, but that included also houses for the middle class. We included in the law a term called priority social housing. It's just an inclusion of the term. That social housing is going to the poor. But only changing the term was great just to foreground when anybody is pushing for a policy and is tackling what. If someone is just promoting social housing, you can already tell that's useless. If you're promoting priority social housing, then that's the program that you as activists, for example, you can align with. So that's a bit of what we try to do. Within this third objective was, for example, the community land trust. That was this idea that I had in my head that I convinced people to to put it there. I think I did it in not in the best way, because we used just a direct translation of community land trust to Peru. We included in the regulation Fideicomiso Comunitario de Tierras, just as the direct translation. Afterwards I would have thought that I should have used other terminology that reflects more the history of collective property in Peru, but nevertheless, people have already been exploring about this. This is a lawyer that has already written about this. They are trying to do a pilot program with that. But this is all in the veins of trying to generate more priority social housing. So that's ongoing again. And people are writing about this and fighting about this, but at least it's just making people think about what is our priority. And there is a big discussion now on what do we do with this fake social housing that we used to have, because there were many companies that were relying on that, and I think that should go away. And a fourth one is local finance for public infrastructure. In here, it was directly the influence of this Lincoln Institute ideas of land value capture, or mobilization of land value, the use of both property tax, the increase of property tax, also the use of other types of taxes that existed in the system that were sometimes curtailed in the 90s in the neoliberal reform, to open them for having the municipalities be able to get more money from their own geographies and rely less on the Ministry of Finance for getting their budgets, but also created new ones, creating not only not only strengthening property tax, but also creating new land value capture instruments. Since that one goes against private property, that was the single most debated topic of the whole reform, the land value capture instrument, because that was going against this private property version of what real estate developers had in mind. But still, it was passed. So that's the whole. You might be familiar a little bit with land value capture instruments, and if not, you should. So on July 14th, 2021, both the law and the policy were scheduled to be debated in the last round of debates, after months of being socialized and reviewed in all the branches of the government. So, for example, that day, and that was not on purpose, that was actually a coincidence. So we had to divide our team. The minister and some advisors went to the president and the cabinet building, and they had to work the national policy there. And me with the deputy minister, the chief lobbyist of the ministry, and the director of general policies, we went to the Congress, to the parliament. And it was just the last round of discussions. But in the last round of discussions, many changes also happened to the law. So, for example, I will be working with the written version of the law, trying to convince some last Congress members. And this was weird because some Congress members were in the parliament, some were just by Zoom because it was still pandemic times, and some of them were just having the written suggestions of the lobbyists of the companies, of the speculators, for example. So there will be congressmen that will come with something that they want to have in the law. So we will have to sit with them in these alleys and negotiate basically the last changes to the law. Then whatever we will be able to negotiate, they will read it out loud for the parliament, and that will go to another version. And those last couple of things were sometimes very awful writings or languages of the law that later I have seen many people try to make sense. Why did they write like this? Because it was just 2 minutes to close this because they are about to call him. And those kind of negotiations were the last round of negotiations that we had there. Eventually it was passed. It was approved by 92 votes in favor, no votes against, and I think 10 votes abstention, like they didn't vote, of 130 members of Congress. So it was passed. I think we lobbied too much, actually. So we could have gotten better things. But yeah, that was a bit of the experience, and that's the policy. And the same day, the national policy was also approved by the president and the cabinet. And actually, that same day, July 14th, I was also given the appointment for my visa interview in the embassy of the U.S. because I was already accepted to the PhD program. And at that moment I thought, oh, should I go? And I almost didn't go to this and go to the visa appointment. But then I did the right thing and then went to this, didn't go to the visa appointment, lost it. But then, I don't know, the minister called or something and they gave me another appointment, another extra appointment. So I came. Okay, so maybe just a couple of last things. All this was done while the government was still running the show in Peru. So the government was responding to crises here and there of different type, only one of which was actually COVID. So just some examples of this. These are some additional regulations that we were approving in that time to increase the capacity of restaurants to use the street tables because there was limited capacity of the business in that time because of the COVID restrictions. So, for example, that picture that I show you signing a regulation, it was the original of this regulation, for example. While we were doing all this, there were many things also happening, and this is, for example, a picture from my window to a protest that they were coming to our building on something that also gave me the sense that people do listen to protests, even if they don't do anything. You can actually not work like normal when there is like a huge protest in your window, which is nice to know for the next protest that I participate in. And the minister was also visiting places, visiting cities, giving titles. In this case, he was giving titles to a police station, and also approving. We were also approving lots of urban plans that the ministry was doing. That were inherited from the previous administrations. So that was still going on in that time. And maybe lastly, before going to the conclusions, about implementation, this is all totally imperfect. It has many shortcomings, and there are many things that have not been applied, or there are some things that have also changed from 2021 to now. People ask me until now a lot about those things, about the delays in the regulations that have to make the detailed regulations of these things. So there is a law, but there have to be specific regulations to apply this. The delay in some of the programs that should be implemented. Sometimes people tell us, why did you not only change the laws, but also change the personnel in the Ministry of Housing? That sometimes is what drags some of the reforms, which is also true. And many times I've also been told, why were you not more radical? And for example, why not collective property as a protagonist of the whole reform and less about social housing, which is not that radical? And of course, all those are I think true. What I usually respond is that even though many things are going to be imperfect and that I think are not going to be applied, in many of those cases, I am happy with the political move of having made a change on something and having changed the language on some things. Just the idea of bringing to the discussion that there is a public interest that has to be balanced with private property, and that pushes things like, for example, these are some examples. Very quickly, with this new regulation, there was the possibility to halt the urbanization of the last green valley that Lima has in the south of Lima, Valle del Urín. And that was done with the idea of just limiting the rights of the property, using the language of the new regulations, and also using some of the land value capture instruments, transfer of development rights as a mode of getting an agreement for halting that development that was going to urbanize all that area. Also, in recent litigation in Peru, there has been a lot of litigation between the municipalities and the Ministry of Housing, the new administration of the Ministry of Housing, for who has to establish some urban planning regulations for specifically social housing projects. And there is a big fight there about decentralization. What's the language and what's the framework used for that litigation that I will be in favor of the municipalities is these new regulations that are being used for that. This is a picture of last week, actually. They are already launching, with the help of the World Bank, some projects of urban regeneration, they call it, instead of urban expansion, with the municipality of Lima. In some places, in this case, it's the Argentina Avenue in the center of the city of Lima, where they are doing some of these projects using the framework that that we've put together, and that's already people working on these kind of things. And just for a lawyer, it's just an incredible thing to see a law that you usually work with, but you have worked on it, and you have worked and actually written it. And again, I see so many times things that I thought, oh, maybe, should I put this? Maybe let's put it. Let's see if someone is going to take it out because this is too much. And it goes through all the filters, and then it stays there, and it's there. So that has happened to me and to my advisors a lot. And let me finish with the lessons. And it's going to be 4 lessons, and I think that should be useful for a conversation. One is that I think there are not clear boundaries between local and global knowledges. I think that might be even obvious, but and I say that because talking with many of you, I've always spoken and advocated for local knowledge and inductive thinking instead of rationalized view of things. But actually, of course, our team was very reliant on this. That's a weird image. The Lincoln Institute policies that are circulating around Latin America, and that has been very much in the heads of many of the people that worked on this. So those ideas have been circulating. It's not something that local. Also, even me, I was coming back from a master in urban planning here, and the two leaders of my teams of the law and of the policy were a graduate also of the MDes, Samantha and Eric, who is there. And they were in my research group, of course, but then I brought them for being the leaders of my teams. And Eric was coming back from a master in UCL in London. So of course there were many things that were coming from these conversations that we had, and it was actually young people also that worked a lot in this. But there were also local knowledges, and the creator of this research group is Luis Rodriguez Rivero. I think, to me, the most brilliant urbanist of Peru that has actually mainly worked in Lima. So I think he has also that knowledge that eventually many of the people that worked in the ministry had in this policy. And actually, I don't know, half of our research group was eventually working in the ministry at that time. So that's a bit of the context of local knowledges and global knowledges circulating. A second point is that quantitative data, unfortunately, prevails over qualitative approaches. And this is connected to, I said, this scientific and engineering vision of urban planning, and maybe of public administration in general. So, for example, even though this analysis and this diagnosis of the city of Lima and of the country in general had already been in the work of some sociologists. For example, Julio Calderón, I think the most brilliant book of Peru, Urban History of Peru in the 21st century, had all this totally figured out. To sell the policy to politicians, to people, to municipalities, you had to have a number for things, and that's still how it mainly works. You have to have a figure in your slides, and that's how you sell. So this Grade consultancy firm did this study, and they got this number. It could be 93, it could be 94, it could be 80, but it's this idea of informality, but putting a number, and that's how we sold this policy. In this is actually, even though that was already in the studies of Julio Calderón. And in that, for example, we used a lot also Lima Como Vamos, which is an institution that Mariana Alegre runs. So that was useful, and that's something that you have to work with, even though, as me, you are critical of that approach, and hopefully in the future there will be less reliance on quantitative approaches to things. There are many things that cannot be quantified. But you have to work with that until now. Then a third it's about actors. So this was a technocratic reform. It was not like very heavily led by communities and mobilization from the ground up. It was a very technocratic approach, and that's totally a self. I acknowledge that for sure, but it told me that it is interesting how much the central figure is usually the administration and the public officials, they are the ones that have the handle of things. After finishing the Master in Urban Planning, I wanted to work in the World Bank. I applied, I passed a couple of rounds, and then I didn't get it. But then this experience showed me how the World Bank is very secondary to what the governments do actually. And they were actually one additional help that we had, but they had been pushing for some reforms like this for years and years in the last maybe 10 years before that. And then only when there was this specific administration pushing forward this, and they have told me it was just surprising to them how many things could be done even though they had been working for this for a while. Academia and activism was also very key. Perhaps academia for thinking the long-term changes, and that's a bit of what I'm trying to do in the PhD now. But still, this lack more rounds of community engagement nationwide, perhaps more participation of local and small municipalities. That's one of the shortcomings that I will say. And one very important there is politics as well. You have to play the game of politics for these kind of things. You had to also go to talk to congressmen, play with what they were wanting from the Ministry of Housing, offer something in exchange for having the space to sell them the law, and also talking with the mayors of municipalities. So it's foolish to think that something could be done technocratically. I think for this class, I think for us it's already clear. But playing the game of politics, it was very much part of this reform. And the last one that I was going to mention is that law helps. This was quite a scary experience. You enter to the public administration, especially in Latin America, and you are usually scared of corruption cases and whether you will have to at some point take a decision whether you do something or not, and that's very scary. And you will think that you will be able to review everything that you sign, but of course that's not possible. My signature was a scanned signature that the administrative assistant that I had the duty to put it in the thousands of documents that had to go out with my signature. So it was just impossible that I will be able to review everything. Even if I had a team just reviewing things, you cannot do that. It is more putting together a team. It is more having some trust with some people, even some people that were already working in the government before I entered, but I could just see their faces and talk to them and trust them. But it was something like that. So it was not something that it was always clear that's the right thing to do, that's not the right thing to do. That it was more problematic to that. So that requires, I think, some bravery, some just going for it, knowing that it's an important moment. And yet, despite of all of that, after I finished from that position, I had 14 corruption inquiries for my administration, from my position, by the National Agency of Control. Only it was last year, 3 years after I had finished, that I was clear of all of them. And I had to send documents, I had to give my version of all these things. And the Contraloria, you guys that are from Peru, you know what the Contraloria is about. So that I will say scares the life out of anyone, especially someone who is not a lawyer. So I don't think that's good. But that was in a way why either being a lawyer or having legal advisor was so important in this. So I think these are things where sometimes architects think about things and then the lawyer comes at the end. In these kind of things, I think the lawyer has to be from the beginning in all these reforms. But there was this that I told you at the beginning, this sense of duty of that particular moment in which we entered this protest that we had participated, and now we had the chance to now do some changes. And of course, it was the most rewarding job that I had in my life. It could also be addictive. That's also something weird, that you can do changes and stay there. And that makes me understand many things also about power, I would say. And it was hard to resign because I was already accepted in the PhD. I had accepted the PhD. But at some point I thought about, should I go to the PhD or should I stay in this position? But I did resign when the new administration came, and I resigned August 30th, and the 1st of September, it was the first day of classes here, and it was just like a sudden change. Yep, that's the experience, and I will be happy to hear what are your thoughts. And yeah, thank you.
You're telling me that job was better than being the TF for this class?
This is easier.
Yeah. No, this is wonderful, and I want people to ask questions. I want to make two comments. Obviously, I'm going to make a couple comments, but one. I want, if we can have a conversation here, maybe we can continue it next week, because next week on Tuesday, I'm going to be talking about informality a little more. You've put so much great material on the table. What I'd like to talk about today is a little bit more of where this amazing narrative about what you did in the planning agencies as a planner, how does it fit as we're moving in this class from thinking about traditions and planning practices and how they've evolved over time, landing in the United States, and then starting with Tuesday with Salvador, we're starting to think about how these ideas are imported or exported elsewhere. You're talking a little about this, but this is also kind of a very different, let's think about what planning looks like from within the context of Peru. And I want us to, I wanted everybody to try to make sense of where we're moving epistemologically in the class. I mean, what value might this deep knowledge that Jose Carlos has shared with us be of you, even to those of you who don't work in Latin America, right? I mean, is there a larger conversation that this very different, if I could say, the way you're talking about planning, let's compare that to what John Forster said planning is, right? Yet that's the kind of dominant model. I'm not saying that's the only model in the United States, but that's kind of where the history and theory of planning in the United States has brought us to. Therapy, meetings, participation, working on the margins. And here we have an example of thinking about changing laws, changing discourses, struggling politically. So I want us to be able to talk about that. And then later, if we need to, on Tuesday, we can talk a little bit more about the community land trust, because I do think that the reason that we wanted Jose Carlos to talk today is because of the article, because that's another way that we're comparing. If you haven't had a chance to read that article, please look at that over the weekend. But the way the idea of land, which gets us back to the U.S. and the European history, the way that planning has become really all about determining land use, private land use, and zoning. Even though John Forster telling us planning is about talking, I mean, there's this big definition of what planning is, and it's about land use. What the article that Jose Carlos and I wrote is trying to say, well, guess what? There are interesting ways in which collective property, which comes from a place like Latin America, is allowed to exist in the United States, but not in the place where it came from. So you kind of turn upside down the idea, what models, are we exporting models from the United States to the Global South, or are we importing models from the Global South to the United States in community land trust, and expecting Latin America to take all the worst things of the North American modernist model while we are innovating from, let's say, collective property or informality. We're innovating, we're allowing informality in the United States. Meanwhile, we're telling everybody in Latin America they have to have private property, you have to have regularization, and you have to follow the U.S. model of planning and zoning, et cetera. So that's why we have this reading, and we can continue that more on next week. But I did want to hear questions for Jose Carlos, or comments or reflections about how, as you're sitting in your studio or, the core, what resonates or not with this description of what the planning process was, with the way you've been doing planning now. Is there any, Jason?
Do you mind if I ask instead, then maybe?
Sure, another question would be great.
Just about the whole informality thing. And I know we had the reading from Kennedy.
Yeah.
And then also we're going to talk next week, but just kind of, there was a thread in the presentation I felt I wasn't really clear on, just because of my lack of knowledge. Could you clarify what? So I have a sense of what the problem is with the informality in Peru, but could you expand on that a little bit? Also the titling that was done and kind of this inadequacy, and then you mentioned cadastre, right? A different way of structuring land ownership that isn't informal and isn't titling. Could you just explore all those things? I know that's maybe a big question, but
but maybe a few things. So informality, my personal opinion, and in the policy it was, we are fighting informality. We're trying to create more formal, cheap houses for people to live there. That's the main thesis of the policy. I think many of us working in the government don't have a negative view of informality because that's the majority of our cities. So if we see much of the tissue of the city, it's neighborhoods that were initially informal, they were eventually given titles, and they are thriving as a part of the city already. And interestingly, that was supplying what the government was not supplying over the 20th century. So then there is that version of that. It is problematic in the most recent occupations, especially when they are going to these more prone to risk areas. But now that tells me that I think our take on informality is to maybe whatever has been done, you cannot just undo it. It will be just undo 90% of the city. You have to work with that, but also you want to start in those spaces that were occupied without that much density. For example, you can do programs of densifying. So all these programs of doing social housing or priority social housing are trying to densify those areas. So that's maybe something that I will tell you in relation to that. So the idea will be, if this will be being applied perfectly, and it's not, is so you're going to recognize whatever is occupied, but you're not going to promise more titles anymore. That's how it should work. It's not necessarily working like that. And the municipalities doing the urban plans need the budgets for doing that, and that's where the cadastre enters. The cadastre is just having the information of the plots of land that you have in your municipality, and that's very critical for doing property tax and land value capture instruments. And that I think is very useful. So those cadastres are useful for that, and basically for empowering financially the local municipalities. That's a bit of the thesis or how we think about this.
Are there any other questions?
I was really interested in the part of the reform that had to do with moving from manuals to guides, and you talked about having this kind of argument with mostly architects about is it okay to just have a map that everybody agrees to? I'm wondering what your argument was in favor of that approach. What did you say to get them to agree to that?
So the core of the argument was, is planning a technical practice or is a political practice? And the view of CONURB is planning is mainly a political thing. So if you agree on a general view of what your town is, especially if it's a town of 5,000 people, and that's where actually I was spending my time during the pandemic in Andahuaylillas, which is a small town near Cusco in the highlands of Peru. There, it will not make sense to me that not only the GIS, but also all the items of these manuals will have to be performed. Like, for example, networks of bicycles, for example. In this town, there doesn't make sense to have bicycles. It's a slope. These streets are with stones from the more medieval type of architecture that they have, or that we have. But still, the manual will require him to have an analysis of the bicycle potentialities, the scenarios, and all that. So that was the core of the argument. Again, was should planning be a political thing or should it be a technical thing? But again, in those, it's not that this view of planning as a political thing won. We had initially defined the plans as political instruments or as agreements of the city, and when we passed all the filters in the public administration, they always try to add the technical element in those languages. So it is not that went totally in our view, but that's a bit of what the discussion was on these kind of things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Jose Carlos. Well, I have two questions. The first perhaps is implicit the answer, but I'm curious to know why you don't consider yourself anymore an urban planner. Perhaps about the scary part of what you mentioned, I don't know. And the second is about I believe the national policy of housing was really useful, but to have a national policy. But at the same time, as Jose Carlos mentioned, this national government was just 1 year. So I would like to know how do you include in this national policy to track or to follow that the consulting companies follow the standardization or the structure that you set up, and also the local governments, because sometimes as Jose Carlos mentioned, Peru has 3 different regions. So how you contemplate that these standardized master plans or urban planning policies could differentiate the geographical area or the culture of each city of the number of population.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah. So to the first one, so I will consider myself an urbanist, a person interested in cities, that studies and research about cities. But urban planning sounds to me the practice of making plans, and it's weird to me that in the US that's a discipline or that's a degree. I think that's something that people of different disciplines do, but that's how I see it. I did, before going to the ministry, work in the urban plan in Lima and in urban plan in Ferreñafe. Maybe the only times in my life that I was an urban planner was when I was working on those urban plans of those 2 cities before going to the ministry. And in the ministry, as you saw, it's a change of laws, it's a change of framework, it's a matter of public administration, of urban policy. And in there, I think I tap on my knowledge of urban studies, my knowledge of law, and of course, common sense, I guess, So that's why I don't see myself an urban planner. Now I'm trying to be a historian. So now it's a different life. The second thing is, so the whole idea of the reform is to debunk the standardization of urban planning and try to give a space for an urban plan to be very different in the rainforest or in the highlands to a plan in the coast. And I think that's more possible now because of this change from manuals to guides that I mentioned. And the question is also, with later administrations, did this stay a little bit? The objective of doing a national policy and a law is that those are difficult to change. Even with a lot of lobby, a lot of money put by the lobby of many companies, they try to change the law a lot, and it was not easy. It's very difficult to pass a law, to change a regulation so technical like the national policy. So they are already having to comply with some of those things. Just let me give you an example. The new plans that have been developed and approved after 2021, they have to have a different type of zoning. We used to have zoning residential, commercial, and industrial, the normal one. We try to change it to a more mixed-use type of one, zoning, and it's now called zoning of intensities, low, medium, or high in terms of intensity. But then there is no idea of separation of uses anymore. And that's already in the plans that are approved in the last year. Those kind of things are being approved, and if someone wouldn't like that, it will be very difficult to change it. So that entrenches some of these reforms, even if people are changing or administration are changing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to make a few final comments because I'm going to have to run out, but people can stay and talk to Jose Carlos. We can continue the conversation on Tuesday because I do think we will be able to carry forward. I guess a couple things to kind of highlight threads from the other day and throughout the semester. So what is really interesting and important that you shared your experience in the national level, even though you've just mentioned that you worked for Lima Urban Planning. So already thinking about what it meant to be a planner in the national ministry is slightly different than what it meant at the local. And I think that's important. Again, you guys know that, but again, we look for these general strategies about planning. But if you're working for a city or for HUD or for a consulting firm or a community, how you define planning will be different, and I think that came through. That's the first, and in particular, you've highlighted the importance in the so-called Global South of the national level really laying out a lot of the kind of framework for it, and even the distinction between the Ministry of Urbanism and Housing. The way I'm here, urbanism is about zoning and land use and some general principles that we might think about linked to a national constitution, and then there are specificities of cities that probably have to work within that framework, but they do more planning. So I think that's an important thing for us to think about, not because I will insist that makes those of you who are interested in the Global South, your planning process totally different than in the Global North, but it's different. However, Jose Carlos mentioned as part of your reform the decentralization. So, and the last thing, your response to this last question, I think it made me, I wrote here, it made me think that we could think about planning as in process or evolving in Peru now. Like it probably is in the Global South, that there are different political administrations come in, the ideas of the Lincoln Land Institute, the global agencies, there's a constant kind of flow of ideas that are kind of moving planning the way it was, let's say, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and early periods of urbanization when we start seeing these ministries. The reason I'm mentioning this, because I think that has positive and negative. If we think about planning in the Global South as more in process, and in the Global North, let's say Boston or other places in the United States, there have been enough years of institutionalization of what planning is. It means there's less room for maneuver because it's really clear who does what. And in a way, part of your story is the struggle over changing who does what. So I think I'd like you to think about that as well, the pros and cons of that. Maybe importing ideas from the Global South to the North. By the end of this class, we can switch it around, not just the idea that we've imported things from the North to the South, because if we're stuck in the United States and doing the same thing we've done for 30 years, but the cities are changing, the world are changing, maybe we want a little more dynamism, and I think that came through. The last thing I would say that I really loved about, where I could also see a parallel between more community, local-based planning as compared to you're talking about working for the national ministry. When you were talking about you summarized the four elements: decentralization, the land, the housing, the finance, and you talked a lot not just about quantitative but also about language. You said not only in the Congress but when you were changing the law regulations, you said that the language was very much in flux. Even if you were not sure you should have used that language, the language is in flux. So it seems to me that what I would say that I learned from you, that planning is the work of changing a political dialogue. Because by changing those words, you change the conversation within the national ministry about planning, because you offered new concepts and new ideas and even the quantitative new material to do the work of planning. And the reason I think that that's a powerful idea is because you could maybe apply that to a community meeting or Revere. Could you think about even doing small modifications in a place where there's not a lot of room for maneuver and expectations are set, that as planners you are changing the political dialogue through your interventions, whether it's with a word in your plan, or whether it's the way you frame something issue. Even you talk about the manuals for the distinction or distinguishing manuals, etc. So think about it, planning as political work, which is not independent from action, but that you want to constantly make it possible. And if you're working in a community, that work involves changing the language or ideas to get people to talk about them more. Because I think that's what you meant in the reforms. you changed the way the Congress talked about it, and then that changed the way local planners could do things because you changed the language. So, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think we're over time.
Yeah, we're
very
over
much,
time.
But I agree.
You agree? Oh. Yeah. Now, let's give another round of applause. And of course, I agree with you that all politics is planning, but what I thought that formulation allows you to think about planning as political work, not there's planning and there's politics. Planning itself is political work, so.
This is the extended version of last year.
You should write a little autobiography.